Hello again, and welcome to the Gaming News Canada show presented by GBG PLC. That's right, in this first week of the final month of 2024, we welcome back GBG as the presenting sponsor of your friendly neighborhood destination for news and insight into the business of sports betting and gaming. We are grateful to Rebecca Jackson and Rebecca Angus for their company support of Gaming News Canada over the next few months. And oh yes, I'm your host, Steve McAllister, joining you from the snowy shores of Lake Huron. Last week, the Court of Appeal for Ontario hosted 3 days of arguments in front of a 5-judge panel around the provincial government's plan to allow legal daily fantasy sports and online poker operators from outside the province to offer their products to players from other jurisdictions beyond Canada. Dave Briggs put the issue quite nicely in the Gaming News Canada newsletter on Friday, and to quote Dave, would legal online gaming and sports betting remain lawful under the criminal code if its users were permitted to participate in games and betting involving individuals outside of Canada? If not, to what extent? Jeff Zakodny, the senior news analyst for Covers, reported that the panel reserved its decision for a later date. I'd recommend not placing a bet on when that decision will come down. Also, if you want to follow a couple other people, Daniel Trujillo of GMA Law blogged about this on the GMA Law website last week. He was following the proceedings. I would suggest following Zakodny on Twitter as well. And also intently watching the lawyers in action was the senior advisor for the Canadian Gaming Association and friend of Gaming News Canada, Amanda Brewer. Amanda, welcome back to the show and happy December.
Thanks, Steve. It's a pleasure to be back here as we close out what has been yet another interesting banner year for iGaming in Ontario and across Canada.
Hey man, I want to get your takeaways because you were I think watching the proceedings virtually last week, if not sitting in the courtroom itself. But there certainly were a lot of fingers in the pie with the arguments presented. Obviously, you had the provincial government making its case. You had operators in Ontario's regulated market who obviously have an interest in this case. The Kahnawake Council, Mohawk Council of Kahnawake, has taken an active interest in this case, along with the Canadian Lottery Coalition, which I believe right now is a coalition of 4 of the provincial lottery and gaming associations across Canada. What I guess the Sparks Note version for you? What were your biggest takeaways from the 3 days of arguments?
Well, one, unfortunately, that having a firm understanding of this industry is not a prerequisite to be a lawyer arguing in for or against this industry. It was a little perplexing and at times very frustrating to listen to some of the testimony that was coming out of the lawyers' mouths on both sides. And when you're listening to an exchange happening between a lawyer and one of the 5 judges on the panel, and you understand quite clearly that what they're talking about is the fairness of the games, but nobody seems to understand that there are game certifications and testing labs, and you can't just launch product into the market unless the AGCO is satisfied that there's been rigorous testing to make sure the game is fair. Anyway, so it got a little bit even comical by the end because you've got people like Paul Burns, who unfortunately was sitting on those very hard benches for most of the 3 days, and then other people like Troy Ross and myself who were kind of keeping it on while we were doing the rest of our work. And yeah, I mean, really, the hope is, saner level heads will prevail and they'll understand that this is an activity that was taking place, pooled international liquidity for products like poker and DFS up until the time that the market launched. And you have poker operators like World Series of Poker and Poker Stars who are here in Ontario as licensed operators who have basically been kneecapped. Their games require big pool, which isn't available right now. And what Ontario is trying to do, you ask anyone who works in this industry as an operator or an advocate for this industry, this is just housekeeping. This is something that our Attorney General and the government lawyers didn't get around to addressing prior to market launch. And right now, our Attorney General is just trying to dot the I's and cross the T's in terms of, making sure that when it comes to our overarching criminal code, this falls on the right side of it. I think actually one of the government lawyers made one of the clearest points about how to think about this reference question that's been asked of the panel. It's about controlling, because we all talk about conduct and manage, and depending on who you are and where you are, it means something different across this country. But in terms of Ontario's interpretation of it and what Ontario wants to do, it's easier to think about. You want to control what's going on within the provincial boundaries, not limiting the activity to within the provincial boundaries. So if you want to look at the people who came in opposition, they want to limit what Ontario can do to just it's inside its boundaries. But the government lawyers are saying, no, that's not how we understand conduct and manage. We get to decide if this is an activity that we are conducting and managing in Ontario, then we get to decide how we conduct and manage the full extent of that activity. So I thought for those who are uninitiated to this, that was a really nice way of describing it.
Yeah, and I think just to take a step back, Amanda, I mean, if you're someone who has been a daily fantasy sports player or an online poker player, uh, this has been going on forever and ever. Where, if you were in Ontario and you were playing in a daily fantasy NFL pool, you were playing against people from Pennsylvania or Michigan or Quebec. Online poker players. There were kind of no borders in the previous I guess unregulated gambling space. So when the Ontario market launched in April 2022, that was one of the things that operators made that decision that time because of the legality to step away from daily fantasy sports and online poker while this got sorted out.
They had two options. They could either come in and understand that until this question got addressed, they were not going to be realizing the same levels of revenue, of players, of volume, track, all of it that they had pre-regulation. So some companies made that decision, trusting that the government, pretty soon after launch would be able to go and fix it, for lack of a better term. You've got other companies like FanDuel and DraftKings who pulled out completely. So their DFS product came out from the market before the market opened. And you've had the gentleman who ran the Daily Fantasy Association here in Ontario on the call in the early days of that market. And you can appreciate for companies like that, we're about to ring the bell on the 3rd-year anniversary for the market launch. I mean, this is probably feeling like 10 years at this point in time for them.
Hey man, how big and again there's been lots going on in the daily fantasy sports space in the US. There's been a virtual bun fight going on there over this year between the FanDuels and DraftKings with Underdog Fantasy and Underdog Fantasy and Prize Picks and other DFS operators. I just wonder like how any idea of how much additional revenue or what that's the slice of the pie would be affected by allowing DFS and online poker?
It's a great question. I can't even hazard a guess for down in the States, but DFS started pre-PAPSA, pre-IG. I mean, it was the way some of these companies could get in a foot in the door without being worried about crossing the line into regulated, online sports betting. And we knew a lot of people, if you work in this industry, you knew a lot of people who were big fans of the early, FanDuel and DraftKings DFS businesses. And, in some respects, it's a little bit, I would look at it a little bit like the sweepstakes model now, which is like, it's a way to attract customers. You're not really gambling, but it can be used as a great recruitment tool so that people can come in and try your product. They can have some fun, betting with, their friends or putting teams together with their friends and, putting wagers on them without all of the, complications necessarily of having to be a full-blown sports bettor. So I see it more as kind of bridging the gap between social gaming and real money gaming. And it just could be a great acquisition tool for some of these operators to have a DFS product. But I think because again, Ontario and Canada so different than the US and that this activity existed long before the regulation came. And back when Tom Mungham, who retired last year, they realized when they were setting this market up, Tom did, that they had to allow as much product as they possibly could, because the more that you disallow, the more incentive you have for customers to go and find it on black market operator websites. And so, as I said earlier, this is, for those of us who have been there since the beginning, we see this as a bit of housekeeping that needs to happen, because it's the reality of the experience that every other province has right now that doesn't have regulation. You can still access international pools for DFS and for poker. And it's really the experience around the world that has this product too. So I think, again, I look at this at face value. This is an Ontario decision, and Ontario will conduct and manage this, and Ontario will decide who they partner with and sign MOUs with. And I'm still really confused about what any other jurisdiction is doing, sticking their nose in our business. But
I just want to,
that's what keeps gaming lawyers in business. So it's all good, I guess.
yeah, exactly. The lawyers are certainly getting their billable hours and Amanda, at the end of the calendar year. I want to make sure I have a couple of things right, Amanda, from what happened last week. And one is that the Ontario operators were arguing that they wouldn't be pursuing DFS and online poker customers in other provinces across the country. Although I have also read that Alberta would like to work with Ontario when they launch the regulated industry, with which we expect will happen in 2025. And then also that the Canadian Lottery Coalition, and again, just to make it specific, that's the Atlantic Lottery Corporation, the British, the BCLC, the Lottery and Gaming Corporation Saskatchewan, and Manitoba Liquor and Lotteries. They're concerned with, I guess, what they are saying are affiliates of Ontario regulated sportsbooks already using their regulated status in Ontario to attract customers from other parts of Canada. Is that right?
Yeah, from what I can understand is they are in full acknowledgement that Ontario can conduct and manage within its borders, and Ontario has set up a regulatory regime, and operators have licenses, so they're not their quarrel isn't with that. It's with the fact that what they have referred to as they refer customers back and forth. There's no kind of really back and forth. It's just if you're a customer here of a licensed operator, and you're sitting somewhere else and they happen to be a gray market operator in that other province, and you're trying to access the Ontario website, you'll be geo-blocked as the regulations require. So they'll just refer you to their gray market website. So that's what they're complaining about, and they're making it sound like it's this great conspiracy that these operators are gladly and willfully sending out of province customers to their other websites, because that's just the way this industry has been working for a very long time. There's also some interesting information introduced by one of the CLC lawyers that seemed to suggest that all these operators showed up like 4 or 5 years ago when the pandemic happened, which was interesting to those of us who've worked in this industry a long time, because we'd probably add, another 10 to 15 years on top of the number that he gave us. These operators have been around for a very, very long time. And when he was questioned by Chief Justice Tulloch, who said, well, if you think they've been around for 4 or 5 years, all you've done is send them cease and desist letters. Why haven't you taken any action against them? You've had ample time to try and do something about it. And it was really interesting because the lawyer for the CLC said quite clearly, we will not sue these operators. There's absolutely no point in them trying to sue these operators because there's no connection to Canada. Their servers are not here. The head offices are not here. They're actually separately structured companies to the licensed operators in Ontario. So it was really telling that they've realized the futility in trying to launch a lawsuit against air, zeros and ones that, flow across cables, but they're still sitting in Ontario trying to interfere in something that Ontario is doing because they're worried that will kind of pick up their customers, or some of their customers will be in their provinces if we open up the pool. So, to that kind of complaint, the rest of us would say then now would really be the time for you to jump in and regulate your activity within your province, and then we can stop having all these conversations, because Alberta will launch at some point in time in the near future, and then you just start lessening the argument with more and more provinces coming online.
Hey, man, when you talk to people within the coalition, they'll tell you that they're not against having a regulated industry at some point, but they are against what they perceive are, I guess, their operators doing business inside their jurisdictions right now. What would be the CGA's, or the regulated operators in Ontario? What would be their response to that?
So was Ontario, and Ontario decided to license and regulate the activity within its province. What other option was there? As the CLC admitted in court last week, you can't sue them. There's nothing to sue here. So, when the train has left the station and it's that far ahead of you, trying to catch up to it is impossible. Like the world has determined how this activity is going to take place, and at this point in time, to pretend otherwise is nonsensical. So the response of anyone else who's sitting in a regulated environment to complaints about unlicensed operators being in that jurisdiction is then license them.
Perhaps
It will
this is
never,
unfair.
but the only other
Okay.
thing you need to understand, it will never be a government priority to do this. It really won't. I mean, with everything else going on in the world, affordable housing and immigration and the environment and mental health and all the rest of these important issues going on in the world, this is never going to be a government's top priority. I would also position this for other provinces as a bit of housekeeping. Like you have a set of standards you can now look at, and you can copy and paste as much as you want. So it wouldn't take necessarily a ton of heavy lifting to have to set something up. Ontario is certainly there to assist. There's a model they can follow or not follow, but I would view this as a bit of housekeeping that needs to take place in other provinces too.
Perhaps this is an unfair question, but I've asked you those before, and so I'll just ask. I don't believe OLG has any skin in the game here, but I'm assuming that's simply because OLG operates within a regulated competitive environment.
Yeah, both Ontario and Alberta are not members of the Canadian Lottery Coalition, and so that probably sends a pretty strong signal as to why they wouldn't be. They both realize that, especially on the OLG side, their business didn't crater. They've done very well. They hold their own, and again, you look at the investment that's come into this province. You look at the training programs that have been developed by colleges and universities. You look at the amount of operators who have come in to open offices and hire locally from this province to work in this industry. It's really a good news economic development story from that point. And Alberta does mean to follow and reap those benefits as well. So, there's no upside to OLG participating in anything that the CLC is doing.
Just, you mentioned, I think, earlier about just some of the confusion around the law last week, and I think it almost feels like these cases, there's almost needs to be an education process for the judges and for others in the courtroom. And I've heard this when we've had people like Jessica Wellman or Steve Ruddick on the show. We've talked about some of the gaming commissions in the U.S. and the members of that commission not having any if any experience in the gambling industry, and we had Paul Burns on the show a couple of weeks ago again talking about the mainstream media coverage of sports betting advertising and the industry, and it still feels like there is a real lack of awareness, and I don't think you can point any fingers here, but there certainly does seem to be a lack of awareness around legalized gambling and where it fits with the Criminal Code of Canada and these types of issues that arise.
Yeah, I mean, you and I were just chatting before we started recording, and it's as someone who earned a master's degree in journalism, it was always drilled into me that I couldn't put fingers to keyboard and write anything until I had facts and certifiable, verifiable facts. And for whatever reason, this has not been anything any of the mainstream media have felt as important as they write about this industry. The AGCO standards have been online since the market opened, and they're there available for anyone to read. They're written very plainly. There's not a lot of them. That's not to suggest there aren't, an appropriate number of standards, but it's not 100 pages of legalese that you need to read. The sections are all there. The information is all there. It's very easy to follow. And it becomes very obvious if you go and read the standards that there are a lot of checks and balances that are in place. And these are not optional standards. These are the mandatory standards that every operator that gets a license in this province has to follow. But it just feels like not a single journalist has bothered to go and look at them. Had they looked at them, then I would have assumed a whole bunch of the reporting that I've read and seen would have had slightly different information provided. The CGA, you talked to Paul, recently commissioned a study from Media Radar to show that the amount of gaming advertising is way less than what mainstream media is purporting it to be. And yet it all just kind of falls on deaf ears. So the hope is as we get into 2025, that again, the temperature is going to go down again. I mean, it always picks up in the fall when hockey comes back, and by the time the Stanley Cup is gone, it goes down again. But the hope is that we can start introducing some of these facts into the discussion. And Paul and I are kind of honest enough with each other, or maybe we're just jaded enough about it. But we've said it's not that we think any mainstream media is going to start writing positive stories about the industry. It's just if they can stop writing the really negative ones, or just stop writing, that would be fine too.
Yeah, and as we've talked about here, Amanda, for the better part of 3.5 years now, I think there's a larger role that the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario and iGaming Ontario can play in communicating that message. I'll just mention too. I mean, Dave Briggs wrote about this in the newsletter on Friday, which was really well done. But the Toronto Star ran an op-ed last week, and again, I'm a great loud defender of traditional media. I think this op-ed fell well below the standards of what we should see in a publication like the Toronto Star. And two things really stuck out. One, to your point about the Media Radar report, is that the author of the op-ed said that was talking about, I think, populist ads or basically sports betting ads all over the place. And as you mentioned, that's not true. And that goes back to that unscientific audit I did when I was COVID stricken back in 2021 or whatever it was. And then the second thing was just throwing it out there that commentators are telling viewers what to bet on, which is just unless I miss it. I mean, I watch a lot of Hockey Night in Canada, and I've yet to see Elliot Friedman or Ron McLean telling Amanda Brewer to put $5 on a same game parlay in the Leafs Lightning game tonight.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't even know. I mean, in the early days when, again, back in the early days when we started having these conversations and, they were still trying to figure out their content and their programming, and it wasn't great. They've made some changes. Still, that has never happened. And, Warren is really good friends with David Amber, so he lives just up the street from us. So we are very big fans of sitting and watching the chit chat, in between the periods during the hockey games, and never is that discussed. So again, I'm completely, aware that there's a lot of US feeds that come up, and there's a lot of conjecture that people make about this industry. But now that we actually have some actual facts about what people are seeing and how much they're seeing, and has the volume increased and how much is being spent on it, to demonstrate that the numbers are much lower than anyone ever described or thought. I think that's the message that just needs to get repeated ad nauseum at this point in time. Because if I see one more article about the tsunami of sports betting advertising,
Yeah,
I,
yeah,
I think collective heads will start to pop off again.
yeah. I just want to say too, Amanda. I mean, I think it's easy to be to make the AGCO as a whipping boy all the time, but there is a marked difference in the advertising that I see on U.S. networks and compared with Ontario. I mean, I think the AGCO, to your point, has done a really good job where they felt they stepped on the use of athletes in commercials and I think the operators, to their credit, I think you look at the ads now, they've taken a step back. It's funny. I was watching a DraftKings commercial in the U.S. with Kevin Hart last night during the Niners football game, and just actively pitching online casino. And it seems to me the advertising in Ontario has been much more responsible, or it's just not quite as in your face as what we see in the U.S.
Yeah, agreed. And I think, in the initial reaction to the AGCO wanting to make those changes, there was a lot of, probably pushback or disappointment. But I think it's all settled down now. We're all used to it. And I do think it does make a pretty strong line in the sand if you look at it. Ontario licensed operators sports betting ad versus what you're seeing in the US. But you touch on another important point too, which is we are still getting tarred and feathered for the US feeds that come into Canada that people watch on their televisions. There's nothing we can do about that. And I don't know if people were complaining about the US ads that they were seeing before Ontario opened, but it all just kind of gets lumped together. So, anyway.
Yeah, and I think again, there's obviously it's incumbent on on the industry to to make sure that proper responsible gambling and programs are in place. We had Ryan McCarthy on the podcast from BCLC last week talking about that. We also know that this industry is has been an economic driver. I mean, the media networks, it's put money in the pockets of media companies that are looking for that right now. It's ironic. The Globe and Mail ran an editorial on betting advertising and Bill S 269 3 weeks ago. And on the web page, when I was reading that op-ed, there were three ads from OLG
Oh,
on that
gee, yeah.
page, right? Which you see quite frequently. And then when you talk to the sports leagues, and I mean the teams through sponsorship deals, and the leagues themselves will tell you that there's a direct link with increased fan engagement to legalize sports betting. So it's not it's a complicated is probably the wrong word, but it is a multi-layer story, and there certainly are benefits to this legal industry in both the U.S. and Canada.
I don't know. Like, I'm old enough that, like, if I'm driving in my car and a song comes on that I don't like, I just change the station, right? Is that so hard? Can you just mute a commercial? Can you just like flick to another station for a minute? I don't know. There's
Yeah,
really easy workarounds to stuff you don't want to see, and it's not just sports betting ads. There's a whole bunch of stuff I don't want to see, and yet, I
yeah,
somehow manage to not complain about it all the time.
yeah, and we also know, Amanda, that teenagers they're not watching they're not sitting down with mom and dad watching Hockey Night in Canada anymore. They're not sitting there for 3 hours and watching an NFL game, or so they're the same thing. If they are watching a game, they're zipping through the ads, or they're on their phone and they're not even paying attention.
Well, at the risk of introducing another fact into this conversation, so when the CGA was talking to Media Radar about the data that they were going to collect, so there's a company called Numerator that goes out and does a lot of research for different demographics when it comes to media viewing habits. And they are not going to be collecting data for under 18s anymore because they don't watch television.
Yeah, there you
That's
go.
not me. That's not me as like a shill for the industry saying that. That's an actual, research company that's saying they don't watch TV anymore. Therefore, we're not even going to bother trying to measure their, media consumption or viewership because there won't be a meaningful enough sample that we can take because they're all on their phones. So you'd have a better chance of trying to get them on TikTok than you would on like, CTV or CBC or any of their other channels. So
Absolutely. Hey man, just a couple of quick questions before we wrap up. And you mentioned earlier about our elected officials having an awful lot on their plate these days. And when you look at Bill S 269, the Globe and Mail editorial was calling for that bill to be passed in the House of Commons before the holiday season. And given you know President-elect Trump and tariffs and immigration and fentanyl and uh, the homelessness crisis right now, and it seems to me the federal government has an awful lot on its plate right now, and whether or not to create a national framework around sports betting advertising is way low on the list of priorities.
I would argue you're 100% correct, but it also goes back to, if we complain that media doesn't do enough research, then senators do probably even less. So, Paul was there testifying, and lots of information was provided to the senators from the association. But the reality is, in 1985, the federal government handed over the powers to the provinces to conduct and manage gaming. And that includes the advertising. We can't control the fact that some of these hockey games are national games, so they will get broadcast across the country, and there will be sports betting ads in them, even though other provinces don't have regulated industries. But what do you want to do? That's a national hockey game. These are some things that are just at such a higher level that for you to want to unpack them just makes it way more complicated than you can just mute the ad or change the channel. That will be a way easier solution than what anyone else is trying to propose at this point in time. And I think too, as we were trying to point out, a lot of them have attached themselves onto these, alcohol standards that the CRTC administers. Well, again, anyone gone and read the AGCO's standards for online gaming? Because they ladder up very closely to those alcohol standards that everyone thinks we should be adopting, but no one's taken the time to read or educate themselves on what the industry is actually doing. So the CGA wrote a piece and they published it on LinkedIn just to push back against it, because it was just egregiously wrong what the Globe and Mail's editorial board decided to publish. And selfishly, you hope the government follows and this bill just goes away, because it had no place being introduced. Yes, responsible frameworks need to exist for all kinds of advertising, and they do. You have Ad Standards Canada, you have Think TV. As Paul pointed out, a lot of the ads, everyone keeps going over to Bristol University in the UK to try and get information on what's going on in Ontario. Well, the ads that they run in the UK, you can go and talk to Catherine McLeod at Think TV. They wouldn't even get passed by Think TV to get onto our airwaves here. So again, we are already head and shoulders above a lot of other jurisdictions when it comes to responsible gambling and making sure that the content that's going on air is really appropriate and meets a whole bunch of the league standards, the broadcaster standards, Think TV standards, AGCO standards. Off the top of my head, that's 4 different sets of standards that a single ad has to meet before it'll go on the air. So again, let's talk about what's really going on. Let's talk about what the operators in the industry are already doing before starting to tell us what we should be doing.
Last two questions. Anything new out of Alberta? Any rumblings, or is the peanut going up the hill at all?
Well, the minister called Bodog out. I saw a newspaper article flash across my Google alerts, and I clicked into it, and he decided to name them and wag his finger at them. I thought, good for him. Nope, haven't heard much. I think things are going to start to slow down a little bit. But my hope is that, Santa gives the Minister Nally, a big dose of kind of go get itness, get it doneness, whatever you want to call it, in his stocking this year at Christmas. And he starts January with a lot of fire beneath him, because last I heard, they have to introduce enabling legislation, which he hoped he'd be the first bill up in the spring session, which starts in February. And the hope is that that's something that can be moving forward. But yeah, we'll see. 2025 could be a really exciting year for Alberta.
I think it was maybe 4 to 6 weeks ago now, Amanda, I talked to somebody, and they mentioned that the operators hadn't been involved in that consultation process yet, and I wonder if there's anything new on that front. And again, I know Dale Nally has been at conferences this year, so I'm sure he has had conversations with those operators. But any update on where that sits?
So Minister Nally and his staff held a number of meetings and roundtables at G2E in October. And a lot of the industry, a lot of the operators were able to sit down. And so it was kind of like a rapid fire consultation with them. But there has been face-to-face time with the industry. It's just the industry right now doesn't have anything to react to. So there's no draft standards. There's no, sort of idea of who the regulator is going to be, how the conduct and manage is going to work. So the industry is just waiting for something to be put out in draft form that it can then respond to. And then I think you'll see more consultation happening at that point.
Okay, great. And last question, and we haven't had you on since the province announced that it was set that AGCO and IGO would operate as separate entities moving forward. And we know that IGO right now is in the process of seeking a successor to Martha Otton, who retires at the end of the year. And that the title of that person will be a president CEO title, which sounds a little bit loftier than Martha's executive director's title. But I don't know if there's much to read into that, or if this position will have this person will have a larger mandate than Martha. But let's wrap it up by just asking about that.
Yeah, I saw Martha at G2E, and when I asked what she was going to be doing, she did tell me that she was heading off to Hawaii in January, so that would be well deserved and a much better place to spend January than here in Toronto, that's for sure. So yes, there is a recruiting firm that's been hired. The job was posted. I believe actually today was the last day to apply. So if you still want to apply, you've got a handful of hours that you can. But my understanding is with that bill that's in place to separate IGO and AGCO, the government still has to enact that. And so you probably will not see a successor to Martha in place until that's all done, because it would be hard to come in and not know if you're an executive director of a subsidiary or you're the president and CEO of an independent entity. So if I were sort of thinking about it, you probably will see someone in place, sort of March, April-ish. I don't think there'll be a new head of IGO in place coming out of the Christmas break.
Great stuff. Amanda Brewer is the senior advisor for the Canadian Gaming Association. Is just gives the show so much knowledge and insight. So Amanda, great to get you back. And I don't know if we'll do maybe a year-end show before the end of the month, or maybe we'll do something early in January, and we'll look
I'll
towards
have to get magic 8 balls and we can shake them and see what's going to happen next year. It's probably more accurate than us trying to sit there and figure it.
Yeah, I think maybe we do a look back again, because 2024 has been a crazy year. I expect 2025 will be crazy as well. But maybe we get you and Phil Gray together, and we kind of do a look back and look ahead before the calendar changes again.
Sounds great. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you, Steve.
That's it for this episode of the Gaming News Canada show, presented by GBG PLC. As always, you can find us on Substack at gamingnewscanada.ca and also on the various podcast platforms. Always grateful to Amanda Brewer for sharing her time and knowledge with us, and we will see everybody again very soon.
Thank you for listening to the Gaming News Canada show. Sign up for our newsletter at gamingnewscanada.ca. Follow Steve McAllister on LinkedIn. Message Steve if you're interested in being a sponsor or featured guest.